This is a plate with food on it. A plate, and on the plate is food. A meal. It's a meal. This food is really good. This meal is really, really good. It tastes really good. This is the life of a person. A person like you or me. We have lives. We begin as babies. This is a baby. And at the end of our lives, we die. How many times in your life have you cooked, made a really good meal? How many times in your life have you cooked, made food, and it tasted really good? A person who cooks, makes food, meals, is called a cook. This person is a cook. They work as a cook, cooking food. It's their job. This person's job is to cook food. Mondays, Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays, and Fridays, he cooks food. He's a cook. This man is called Bob. This man is called Tim. There's two men. Here is a third man. This third man asks Bob and Tim a question. A question. He asks them something, but he doesn't ask Bob the same question as he asks Tim. He asks the two men different questions. Similar questions, but a bit different. He asks Bob, can Bob think of, remember, think of six times when Bob cooked really nice food. This man asks Bob to think of 6 times when Bob cooked really nice tasting food. Then he asks Tim a similar question. He asks Tim to think of, to try and remember 12 times when Tim has made really nice food. Not during their lives, not 6 or 12 times in their entire lives, just in the last 2 weeks. 1, 2, the last 2 weeks. 6 times or 12 times when they cooked nice food. Bob immediately, like that, no time, in no time at all, immediately, Bob thinks of two times in the last 2 weeks when he cooked nice food. 1 time, 2 times. It was easy. It was easy for Bob to remember 2 times. Bob has to try a bit harder to think of the third time. It takes Bob a bit more time to think of the third example, the third time. But he does it the third time. It's a bit more difficult, but he does it. But then to think of a 4th time, a 5th time, and a 6th time, it gets even harder. Bob has to try pretty hard to think of a 4th time in the last 2 weeks when he cooked really nice food, and the same for the 5th and 6th times. It's pretty difficult. It's pretty hard. It takes Bob quite a bit of time thinking to reach the 6th. But eventually he's thought of 6 times, all 6 times in the last 2 weeks when he cooked well. At the beginning, for the first one, it's pretty easy. For the 6th, it's a bit harder, a bit more difficult. For Tim, it's the same. The first 3 times is pretty easy to think of. The 4th, 5th, and 6th times are a bit more difficult. It takes Tim more time to think of examples for when he's cooked really well in the last 2 weeks. But he does it. He reaches 6, the same as Bob. But Tim's question was different. He has to think of 12 times in the last 2 weeks. He has to think of twice as many as Bob. 12 is twice as many as 6. So the first 6 examples weren't so difficult. But then, from then on, From then on, it gets really difficult to think of the last 6. These are the first 6. To think of the last 6, 6 more times in the last 2 weeks when Tim cooked good food, when he made food that tasted really good. To think of 6 more examples of this is really hard. It's really difficult. Tim struggles. He struggles to think of 6 more examples. He struggles. It takes a huge amount of time. A huge amount of time. He slowly, very slowly thinks of another 6 times. But eventually, he does it. Eventually, Tim thinks of 12 times in the last 2 weeks when he cooked really good food. So in the end, what happens? This man, the third man, asks another question. He asks a second question to Bob and Tim. This time, it's the same question for each of them. The question is, are you a good cook? Remember that a cook is a person who cooks, who makes food. And this man asks Bob and Tim, are you a good or a bad cook? He asks Bob, do you cook, make food well? Bob says, he replies, he answers the question. He says, yes, I am a good cook. I cook, I make food very well. I make very good, very nice food. Because Bob remembers 6 times in the last 2 weeks when he made good food. And thinking of those 6 times was pretty easy. It wasn't hard for Bob to think of 6 times. It was easy. So Bob thinks that if it's easy to think of, to remember times when he's cooked good food, then he must be a good cook. Tim answers the question differently. He gives a different answer. The third man asks the question to Tim. He asks Tim, are you a good cook? And Tim says, no, I can't be a good cook. I can't be, because for Tim, it was really hard to think of, to come up with, to come up with, to remember, all 12 times in the last 2 weeks when he cooked good food. So Tim thinks, he thinks that if it was hard, if he struggled to come up with all 12 times, then he can't be a good cook. Bob and Tim answer the question differently. They give different answers, which is strange. It's strange because both of them, both Bob and Tim, cooked good food 6 times in the last 2 weeks. And Tim cooked even more than 6 times. He can think of 12 times when he cooked good food. So if Bob is a good cook, then Tim must also be a good cook. Right? It's strange. Our minds, our brains inside our heads, my head, my mind, my brain is inside my head. Our minds, how we think is a bit strange. How our minds work, how they run, how they operate is a bit strange. All right. See ya.